we have to keep in mind, as we study the Torah, we have to keep in mind that there is a theme.
Okay.
And we really don't want to stray from that theme, because then we lose the whole point. The stories don't seem to be deeply connected, but they all are. And so we have to maintain that flow. Otherwise, we're taking things out of context and we get really sidetracked. So, what is the theme? The theme is God created a world that needs work. It's a fixer-upper.
Nice.
And it's taken 5,000 and some years, and we're still not finished. But we got to keep that in mind, because everything the Torah tells us is directly related to that project. How do we make the world a more godly place? Because that's what it was created for, to become a more godly place than heaven. The world, even the physical world, has to absorb some godliness to where its potential is ready to be revealed, whereas today it's concealed and in some cases locked away. So, a few things about Noach. The flood was an important and necessary experience, similar to a person going to a mikveh. Going to a mikveh, immersing yourself in natural waters, brings a certain cleansing and a certain refinement. In order for the mikveh to be kosher, it has to have a size, a volume of 40 gallons. I'm just using that as a...
Okay.
But it's the number 40. The flood covered the world, even the tops of the mountains, so that it's like immersing in a mikveh. And it was 40 days or 40 nights. The number 40, again, is significant. Now, what happened as a result of the flood, aside from the devastation that it brought, it also stabilized the world. It made the world the world as we know it today. Before the flood, people lived to be 970 years old. Animals were immense. Vegetables, fruits were huge. Everything was what we now would consider disproportionately large. After the flood, the world became pretty much as we know it today. 120 years is the lifespan of a human being. Animals don't get to be 60 feet tall. Fruits are not huge and don't have to be carried by 3 people. So the flood actually introduced the world that needs to be elevated, repaired, and made godly. This explains a very important thing. We all know about the 7 Noahide laws.
Right.
The 7 commandments given to Noah. But 6 of those 7 commandments were given to Adam and Eve 1,000 years before Noah. The 7th commandment was added when God gave permission to eat meat, which only happened after the flood. So for the first 1,000 years, people were vegetarian because God had never given permission to eat meat. The Torah says, of all the trees of the garden you may eat. That was the only permission we were given, to eat the fruit of the tree.
That's right.
After the flood, God said, you may eat meat, but don't be cruel to the animal.
So it's true that Noah, that they were all vegans before the flood, or vegetarians at least.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Okay, so
the 7th commandment, not to be cruel to animals, was introduced to Noah. But why would it be called the Noahide laws when 6 of the 7 were really given to Adam and Eve.
That's a great point.
So they should be called the Adam and Eve laws.
Right.
But all 7 of them, not just the 7th, all 7 of them are called Noahide laws because keeping those laws before the flood didn't accomplish what they are supposed to accomplish. They're all supposed to affect the world, make the world more inhabitable, not only for human beings, but also for God. And that really started with Noah because it only works after the flood. Now that the world is physically in the condition that was meant to be, now we can elevate this world properly. For the first 1,000 years, we might say that although Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, but to some degree they were still living that idyllic life. Some degree of immortality. To live 970 years is not exactly the definition of mortality as we know it.
Right, right.
So there was still some of that heavenly stuff where the earth had not really settled down to become earthy. And so the mitzvahs performed in the first 1,000 years were too spiritual. They weren't accomplishing what the mitzvah today accomplishes. So the message to the whole world is, when you keep the 7 laws, and most people do, but when you keep the 7 laws, know that what you're doing is preparing the world for God's comfort, to make the world comfortable and welcoming to its creator. Because, ironically, the creation is not friendly to its creator.
Is it right to say that, pardon me for bringing this in, but Christianity's view is that the Mashiach's supposed to have come and then all this stuff is supposed to be repaired. But according to the Tanakh, it's the other way around, right? The repair of the world takes place and then Mashiach comes to the righteous, not to make them righteous. Was that correct?
Not the completely righteous.
Okay.
We're not going to be saints, but definitely capable of living up to his standard. Because he's going to introduce a whole new way of understanding.
Rabbi, your microphone just started cutting out a little bit.
Yeah, I heard it.
Did you hear it too?
I hear an echo. No, it's better now.
Oh, okay, good. Okay.
Good.
Very good.
So, yeah, Mashiach is not going to do the whole job, because if that were the case, he could have come 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 4,000 years ago. Obviously, he is not the problem.
Right. Good
But
point.
what are we waiting for? What is God waiting for all these years? It must be that he's waiting for us to be ready. Because obviously we're not so ready.
Right.
Not ready to cooperate. We're not ready to, we can't handle the truth. So we're not completely ready. Although much more ready than in previous generations. So we are making progress, but we've got some ways to go yet.
Okay.
So the laws are called Noahide laws because only in the times of Noah did they become really effective in producing the world that we're supposed to be producing. Now the problem is that Noach, although he was a tzaddik and he walked with God, but he was not able to bridge the gap between being godly himself and inspiring those who were not. It seems like you had to make a choice. Either you live isolated from the corruption of the world, or you live in the world and become corrupted by it. So Noach was righteous in that he stayed away from the corruption. On the other hand, he built the ark over the course of 120 years. It's a big project, and he worked pretty much alone. So it took 120 years. But in that 120 years, he couldn't convince anyone to join him when the floods began. No one believed him. Not that that was his fault.
I was going to say, was it because he didn't try, or was he kind of like an introvert, or was it just because they were stubborn?
I think it was just the condition of the world where godliness was new to the world.
Right, gotcha.
So the two were incompatible. If you were godly, you could not really participate in the worldly activities. And if you participated in worldly activities, you lost your godliness. So Noach was a tzaddik in that circumstance.
Wow. You know, that kind of, in a way that kind of hurts. Because when you were saying this, it's like I think about, you know, my daily activities, and I'm thinking, yeah, I could spend a lot more time studying and less time doing worldly things. So I'm learning as I go.
Well, but on the other hand, it's really encouraging because the world today is not the world of Noach. We are the children of Noach, B'nai Noach. And the B'nai Noach can do more than Noach could. Because we live in a time when you can very much be part of the world and still be godly. We have made some progress. For example, the vast majority of people in the world know about God, believe in God in some way, although they can be a little misled as to what exactly God wants. But they do believe in God, they believe in the Ten Commandments, and they believe in the world becoming better. So we don't need to argue those things with people. We just have to convince them that they can do it. So we have come a long way. Today we can be very much part of the world and yet introduce godliness to the most earthy of activities in our earthly life. And that really is the whole purpose. The purpose is not to avoid the world or to transcend the world or to isolate yourself, lock yourself into an ark to protect yourself from the unholiness on the outside. Noach had to be convinced to leave the ark when the flood was over because it was so nice in there. It was like being in heaven.
Wow.
There was peace. The wolf and the lamb lived in peace.
Would it be, is it correct that for the sake of saving space per se, I always kind of pictured that whenever Hashem had brought the animals to Noach, that they weren't full-grown animals, but maybe they were babies, so they could go there and they wouldn't be trying to produce, they wouldn't take up so much space, they wouldn't be eating as much food and such like that. Is that how it probably happened, or is there a different view on that?
Yeah, sounds practical.
Right. Gotcha. That's cool. Whenever, you know, a lot of people are, even today that I meet, just on Facebook and such, a lot of people take issue with drinking, you know, in general. And I noticed when Noach, and they'll use the story where Noach had, you know, grew a vineyard and he got drunk, and that's when all this bad stuff happened to him. And but I don't know. I don't get that message from that. Is there a proper view on this?
Let's take a more spiritual view of it.
Okay.
In keeping with our theme, Noach, coming out of the ark, was a spiritual person. And the idea of drinking, of wine, is that it represents the spiritual part of Torah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So again, Noah's problem was that he was too spiritual for the physical world. And that's why it did not inspire all of his children. So they misunderstood his spirituality, thinking that to be spiritual means to stay out of the world and to not live in the world, which they could not accept. And so that created a rift between the father and the children. The children went off looking for a more earthly way, because after the flood, that's what was required. Noah still belonged to the previous generation, the more spiritual generation. You see, and the same thing happened with the Jewish people. After 40 years in the desert, they were hesitant to go into the land of Israel, because then they would have to become earthy.
Right.
In the desert, they were very spiritual. They ate food from heaven. Once they come into Israel, they're going to have to plow and work the soil and produce wheat, and it would have to be earthy. And they were afraid that if they became earthy, they would lose their spirituality. Because to some degree, they are incompatible. I mean, even today, people think that if you want to be holy and spiritual, you have to live on a mountaintop, you have to take a vow of poverty, you have to be celibate, you got to stay away from the corrupting influences of earth and live with your head in heaven.
Right.
But that's not doing anybody any good. And that's certainly not God's plan. So we keep the mitzvahs, we fulfill God's commandments, not because we want to get to heaven, but because He wants to be present on earth. Now, how's that for a turnaround?
Unbelievable.
We're not behaving in order to get to heaven. We started off in heaven. We're just going to go back to where we came from?
Right.
But God wants to be present on earth, and that hasn't happened yet. So that's a challenge, and that's called serving God. The call of the hour today is not to be righteous or spiritual. The call of the hour today is to serve God's purpose. Forget about getting to heaven. What are we going to do about earth?
Which is the tikkun olam idea.
Yeah.
Social justice.
But also not for our sake,
Okay.
not because I want to have a clean environment and I want to have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. We're talking about something much more ambitious than that. We want to have a world in which God is comfortable and evident and present, so that it's the world that He created it to become.
Okay, another on topic, another derail. The story after the flood, where Shem, Ham, and Yafet had their little situation. Is it clear? Is there a tradition understanding that scenario with Ham and how he was basically shunned because of what he did, or was this just like a generalized something naughty that came of this whole thing, or is it something specific?
No, there's a great important message here.
Okay.
We're not just talking about some guy who was bad.
Okay.
That's never the purpose of a story in the Torah. We don't need Torah to tell us that there were bad guys. We got our own bad guys. We don't need biblical images of bad. We see that everywhere. So the story has to be a little more meaningful than the kind of stuff we would understand by ourselves anyway. So here's the story. 3 sons had to deal with their father's inappropriate behavior. How do you deal with that? So there are 2 ways. When you see someone in a bad condition, what is it you focus on and what do you take away? Ham came away and said, there's something really wrong with Papa. He's not the holy guy you think he was. And so his opinion of his father changed. He lost respect for his father. The other two, as the Torah tells us, simply took a blanket and covered their father, which means they saw a need, not a failing. So their opinion of their father didn't change. They simply saw that their father needs a blanket. So they got him a blanket.
Nice.
So when we look at people's faults, people who are important to us, what are we supposed to see? And if you want to speak of it in divine language, why does God allow one human being to see the faults of another human being? It didn't have to be this way. It's like, why does God allow one human being the power and the ability to take the life of another human being? And then command us not to murder. So there's got to be an explanation. It's not just, that's nature. God designed nature. So God designed the world in such a way that one human being has influence, a great influence, on another human being's life. We are interdependent and intervulnerable. We're vulnerable to each other, which is a good thing when it's treated with respect. It can also become a terrible thing. It can become murder when you mistreat it. So, when we see the fault of another human being, there's a reason for it, a moral reason. God allows us to see another person's failure so that we would lose respect, so that we can ridicule them, so that we can feel superior? Obviously not. God allows us to see other people's failure for one of two reasons. One is to serve as a mirror. Why is it that you recognize a failure in another person? Because you're capable of the same failure. If a person does something that you are simply not capable of, you won't notice it. You only notice what is familiar. So when we look at another person's fault, we're really seeing a reflection of ourselves, so we know what we need to do to fix ourselves. Or the other reason that God allows us to see another person's fault or failure is so that we take responsibility to correct it and repair it. So the other sons of Noah, they saw the need, something needs to be fixed, something needs to be corrected, so they went and did it. They didn't see it as a criticism of their father. And that's the wording. If you take a look at the wording, they walked in backwards, covered their father, and their father's nakedness they never saw. Now, if they never saw, why did they bring a blanket? And where did they put the blanket?
Right.
Obviously, they saw he was naked and needed a blanket, but they never saw a nakedness in their father. In other words, they didn't see it as a flaw, a character flaw in their father. They simply saw a need for a blanket. So this is a moral lesson for all times. It's not just bad-mouthing Chum.
Okay. Was Noah wrong in getting drunk, and was there something there that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think that he was on a spiritual level that his children could not appreciate.
Okay, gotcha. All right,
So to them, it looked like he was failing, like he was out of touch. That's pretty much how we all think of our parents.
Gotcha. Okay, well,
let's the old generation. They're not in touch with reality, and then we lose respect for them and dismiss them as irrelevant. Shalom Aleichem. How are you? You know, I do a lot of talking, a lot of Zooming, many classes, many subjects, but that's all formal stuff. Hopefully good stuff, but formal. We also have a Wednesday night meeting that's more informal and kind of Hamish. If you want to join us for that kind of an event, interactive, time for questions and so on. If you want to join us for this side of conversation, click on the link below and join us every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock. Well, maybe not every Wednesday night, but we try to make it every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock, a more informal chat, which can be more enjoyable at times than the formal stuff. So check it out. Click on the link and join us. Try it. You'll like it.